Hey sis, I am preparing to celebrate my book versary. That's right, my book Overcoming Father Wounds is approaching the 1 year anniversary. Oh my gosh, can you believe it? And so I'm going to be sharing a couple of excerpts from some of my previous writings, either from a blog or from a book. And I hope that it blesses and encourages you. My announcement triggered women to speak words they'd been wanting to say. I'm going to write a blog for women with father wounds, I said. Instantly, their body language responded before their mouths ever did. Whether I was in the salon, on a play date with my kids, or at work, women had something to say about their father-daughter relationships. I just met my dad 2 weeks ago. I don't know who my father is. My daddy was an alcoholic. I heard my father call my mother a heifer. My dad introduced me as his son. Their words indicated a blog about father wounds was warranted, so I began to write. Excitedly, I shared my new venture with everyone, friends, strangers, and a few members of my family. I posted articles on social media, I shared my website link at conferences, and I talked about my blog at gatherings among friends. I told everyone who would listen, everyone except my father. For 4 years, I intentionally kept him in the dark. Telling him about my blog would force me to have a conversation about us. Like peeling back the layers of an onion, I would have to reveal the motivation behind my writing. Consequently, when it came to having this difficult conversation, fear cloaked itself around me like a winter coat. I couldn't do it, y'all. With ease, I could be brutally honest with the entire world about topics ranging from relationships to emotional healing, but with my dad, I said nothing. Pinpointing why is difficult and a little obvious. Part of me was content having what I call weather conversations. You know, when you talk about rain and the lack thereof, so you could say that you did actually have a conversation. Surface conversations were safe. They were easy. There was no speculation on what the outcome would be. Simply chat on the phone for a few minutes and repeat in a week or so and say that you did have a conversation. But fear was not my only obstacle. There was shame that was also present. She reminded me of the various ways that I had learned to cope with my father's absence, often bringing up my more than a decade-long struggle with self-esteem and self-worth, emotions, and males. These were not things that I wished to discuss with my father. If I'm honest, part of me wanted to protect my father from knowing how his absence had impacted me. Keep things light and on the surface. Talk about the weather. Avoid confrontation. Don't rock the boat. As a self-proclaimed people pleaser, these words became my mantra when it came to my father. I reasoned that our relationship wasn't strong enough to handle the truth. After all, I had spent all of my adult life trying to build a relationship with my dad. Despite these efforts, the chasm, although smaller, still existed. In some ways, we remained like strangers, meeting for the first time over and over again. He, a Haitian-born man, several years my senior, and I, his American-born daughter, now middle-aged and still grappling with his absence in my life. Inwardly, I had every intention of telling my dad about my blog, but I could never seem to muster up the courage until God began to nudge me to do so. One day, without warning, a thought popped into my mind. You should tell your father about your blog. Initially, I dismissed this notion, believing it was a far-fetched and random idea, but it returned with even greater persistence. Often, this is how God communicates with me. An insistent thought that just won't go away or leave eventually becomes the next act of faith that God is nudging me to take. It wasn't an immediate move of obedience, albeit, but eventually I decided to have a difficult conversation with my father. From the day I purchased my plane ticket, I thought about what I would say. How would I begin the conversation? How would he respond? When my departure date arrived, almost every second was filled with thoughts of the approaching meeting between my father and I. All I could think about were my words and his response over and over again. When I felt like backing out, I remembered the Apostle Paul's letter to Timothy in 2 Timothy 1:7 that says this, "For God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind." I repeated these words to myself, allowing them to propel me forward. As I got into the rental car and drove to his house, silence magnified the moment. I questioned whether I was doing the right thing. Determined, I stepped out of the car, placed my feet on the gravel, and walked down the broken sidewalk towards my father's house. I knocked on the screen door, secretly hoping that maybe he's not at home and he's not going to answer, but he did. With a welcoming smile, he opened the door and my heart sank as I thought about the conversation that I intended to have. Upon entering the house, temptation enticed me into having, you guessed it, a weather conversation. And I succumbed, but it was over almost as soon as it began. Unsuccessfully, I searched for other things that we could talk about. Sports, current events, anything to pass the time, but nothing was sufficient. And we eventually returned to a very loud and almost deafening silence. My unspoken words continued to remind me why I traveled more than 800 miles to see my father. I wanted to run, y'all, and I contemplated not going through with it, but I knew now was the time. Then courage decided to show up, nervously and with the awkwardness of a new kid on the first day of school. I opened my mouth to speak. Well, Dad, I actually wanted to talk to you about what it was like growing up. Pause. Without you, I began. It was hard. I continued. I needed you. I added. I struggled. As much as I love to talk, at best I stumbled through this conversation. After talking for a few minutes, I reached the pinnacle of my mini soliloquy and said what I should have said 4 years ago. Dad, I started a blog for women with father wounds, I said, culminating my confession. Whew, I got it out. I thought to myself, but I knew that was not really enough to help him understand. So I took out my cell phone, yep, I did, clicked on the internet app and typed the URL for my blog. As my homepage showed up on the screen, I timidly passed the device over to my father. Silence ensued as he scrolled the surface of my cell phone. After several moments of holding my breath, he eventually responded. Most of the words that he said on that day are really a bit of a blur, but the ones that stand out are, "I understand," and "I'm sorry." Immediately, I thought of all the times I had longed to hear my father say those words. "I'm sorry. I apologize." I remembered the difficult years of not knowing where he was and why he didn't stay to raise me. I thought about all of my challenges with self-esteem, the opposite sex, and my emotions. I thought about the many, many years that I struggled, and yet in that moment, I knew peace. That peace that surpasses all understanding, Philippians 4:7. God had already healed my broken heart, and I had forgiven my father by the grace of God. Although I cherished and appreciated his words, I was not dependent on them. I thanked him, but knew my peace was not rooted in him, but in God, just as it says in Colossians 3:15. Let the peace of Christ rule in your heart, since as members of one body, you were called to peace. When it was time to go, I stood up and hugged my father with a clear conscience. I felt myself breathing normally again. I did it. God had given me the courage to have a difficult conversation with my father about my blog, and I was better for it. Sis, if you are struggling to have a difficult conversation, know that God will give you the courage and the confidence to do it. I hope you were encouraged by this excerpt, and I want to invite you to join me next week for 7 ways to overcome father wounds.